Can everybody hear me okay? I can see thumbs up. Fantastic. Hello there. So my name is Carissa Bardsley and I am the Individual Giving Manager at the college. Welcome to the first event of the Atlantic Circle InConversation series of 2021. Today's talk's title is Women in Business, Spotlight on Blanca, Juti in conversation with Rhian-Anwen Hamill. Before we begin today's event, please can you rename yourselves on the screen so we can see your name and affiliation to the college. Please also can you keep yourselves muted throughout the event until the Q&A session at the end, where you'll be more than welcome to unmute yourselves to ask any questions that you may have. The Q&A will be moderated by Rhian herself and Magda Joshi, who is the Events and Alumni Engagement Manager at the college. And if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to type them in the chat box. So in this conversation, Rhian and Blanca, two UWC graduates and friends, discuss Blanca's career journey, her hopes and aspirations, as well as the dilemmas she has faced as a business leader along the way. Blanca has worked across the globe in various industries such as entertainment, food and beverage, and now beauty. And I'd like to begin by congratulating her as she has just begun her new role as Chief Communications and Public Affairs Officer for L'Oréal. So I'm now delighted, without further ado, to hand you over to today's host, Rhian, who has been an owner entrepreneur for over 20 years and has a broad range of skills and experience. She is a business advisor and coach with an expertise in a deep fascination for how people operate in their working lives. Thank you, Rhian.
Okay, Carissa, thank you very much. Up to Blanca and I to live up to these rather august introductions that you've made. And of course, many people in this conversation will know us both in completely different guises and may well be having a bit of a giggle thinking of us when we were 16.
In that wetsuit.
In the wetsuit, the bouncy wetsuit.
Yeah.
So Blanca, this is just the latest in a series of conversations that I realize we've been having for over 35 years, one way or another. When you burst on the scene, a sort of giggly and funny and vivacious ball of energy from Mexico to Atlantic College. You were my first year then. Your brother, Pepe, was my peer. Mm-hmm. And we then also ended up at university in the same college together. And really, you've had an extraordinary life in many ways, lots of locations, lots of languages, lots of disciplines. And I thought I'd just start by asking you to talk about this latest phase, as Carissa said. Tell us where you are now and what you're about to embark on.
Yes, so I'm sitting in the headquarters of L'Oréal in Paris. It's my 4th day in the job. 8 weeks ago, I didn't know I would be sitting on this desk. It all happened rather fast. I got a call from L'Oréal when I wasn't, to be honest, looking. I had left my previous job at Heineken after 4 fabulous years in the summer. There was the CEO transition. I felt the transformation I was meant to drive there had been driven, and I was anxious to learn new things. So I thought it was a good moment in time to hand on the baton to my successor and take some time off. I was hoping to write a book, as I've always done in my sabbaticals. This was my 3rd. I took 6 months out. But I started to get a few calls. And by the way, I ended up in Finland with my husband because there's very little COVID there. So I was hibernating in the north and enjoying it. And I got a call some 2 months ago, and the conversation went on, and L'Oréal was looking for somebody to drive a transformation in communications and public affairs. And they liked the fact that I have a diverse background in terms of industries, in terms of geographical places, and in terms of disciplines, because I've done everything from communication, sales, investor relations, public affairs. I've done a broad thing, and they thought it would be helpful at this level. So I've joined the executive committee of L'Oréal. And that's what I'm going to do now. The next 2 months, I'm just listening. So the first thing I do is I observe and listen and try to suck in the culture and understand how things work. And only then, when I understand what's needed, then I get together with a team and we form a vision. So at the moment, I'm at that stage where I'm just a sponge and I'm absorbing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wondered, you talk about listening, but I also know that you're a good one for telling a story. And I'm not surprised that communications is where you've ended up with your craft at its highest level. I wondered about your first degree in anthropology. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what sort of bearing it had on your career in business from the point of view of storytelling, but also in other ways. You know, mm-hmm. How have you used it? How do you see it playing out in corporate life around you?
Yeah, well, actually, it's very central to my life, my degree. It's, you know, when I started studying anthropology, my brother, if he's listening, my little brother, he probably died, but he told me that, Blanca, what on earth are you going to do? That's just so unmarketable. You're never going to get a job. And of course, it is an odd degree to study, to be quite frank. But I wish more people did it. And I think corporations are tapping into anthropologists a lot more than in the past. Anthropology is really about understanding why groups of people behave in certain ways. And for instance, when you join a corporation, it's very useful. I remember when I joined Heineken, and I went to my first executive committee meeting. So we were there, the executive team. I could tell everything about the power structure of the company by just looking at where people were sitting. And my question was, is this seating that changes or is this stable? And when I knew it was stable, it told me everything because I could see the hierarchy in 2 minutes. So it helps to understand and absorb. It helps a lot. There is also a connection in a way with literature, which I studied later, and you alluded to that in terms of storytelling, because of course, in anthropology, you also look at archetypes a lot. And the story arch is always the archetypical story arch. As you know, you start life and then there's an enemy and then you go into the underworld and you have foes, but you have friends and you come out at the other end. That's the line of any story. And as an anthropologist, you know this, and it goes in many cultures. And so I think in a way those two things come together and they're quite useful for me. Storytelling, not only, by the way, in communications, it's in sales, incredibly important. In government affairs, incredibly important. You need to be able to connect with a story. In my case, I always feel it's important that the story is true and it has integrity and authenticity, but it's a story that connects in the end, right? Facts alone don't connect. You have to give them a thread. So I find that it is rather useful.
Yeah, you create a narrative.
Yeah,
all the way through, whether it's your own narrative, that of your organization, your product. It's very important to be able to create that narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I suppose organizations are also, at the end of the day, quite tribal, and people feel they belong to organizations, or at least when we went into business, there was no problem with sort of putting on the skin of an organization for a while to learn your trade. And then from there, you know, people didn't really worry so much about becoming one's own franchise at the beginning, at least. Yeah. Although I noticed with young people these days, they have a sort of slightly different set of expectations about businesses. They don't necessarily want to belong in the same way that we might have accepted at the beginning of our careers. Do you think there's anything in that?
That's a very good question. I think there is always that in human society and in human identity, there is that need for belonging. So I think young people also have that need. I think what's different is that they're asking for a sense of purpose. They're saying doing business just for doing business, just for selling one extra cream or one extra phone in my case, or one extra, it doesn't do it for me. They want to understand how this contributes to society and what role it has to play. And I think that's a very fair question. I believe as a businesswoman that businesses thrive when you find the intersection between the business itself and what it's driving, which is sales, and the societal needs. If you don't find that intersection, then the business will not do well, because it will not be trusted by society, by consumers, by governments, etc. And what people are asking is more of that. They're asking, why do we do this product? What role does it have? How do we pay our employees? What do we think about the planet? How do we contribute to the planet, or biodiversity, or to lowering plastics, or whatever? And I really, really welcome that in young people. I love it.
Yeah, and perhaps after this pandemic, certainly during this pandemic, since we're still in it, I think people do wonder what matters to them, and they reflect again on that. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about how you see business contending with that question, and how it can be a force for good in different ways, and what you plan to do in your current role to kind of explore that question with L'Oreal and others.
No, it's a good question. I never, you know me well. And when I was at AC and when I was at university, I never thought I would work for a corporation. In fact, I thought I could never give my heart or my soul or my identity to a corporation. And yet here I am. And it happened in a very serendipitous manner. But the first job I had was, of course, with Nokia. And those days, I understood that what Nokia was doing in giving one phone to every person in the world was a huge step in development, because when I was a child, there was one phone per 10 families. And when you don't have a phone, you don't have access to information. You rely on other people to give you information. Once you have a phone, you have access to jobs, you have access to a lot of things directly without an intermediary. And then once you have a phone with internet, then you have access to a lot more. And I could see that this technology was allowing GDP growth, and it was allowing a number of things. So for me, I have always looked for that sense of purpose, because clearly I really couldn't feel that I was just working for profits alone. I had to feel, we are employing people, we are behaving ethically, we are giving phones, whatever. So now at L'Oreal, it's an interesting question, because of course, the first question I ask myself when a company calls is, what area of business are they? And is this something where I could potentially play a role? And I thought a lot about beauty, and what is beauty, and is it relevant, and all of this stuff. And then I started to look, and I realized as an anthropologist is that, of course, beauty has been a human need from the beginning of times. We know from caves, we find pigments, we find, jewelry, we find all sorts of things through the history. So it has always been a necessity. It's a way how you demonstrate your identity. It's a way how you express yourself, etc. So then the next question is, okay, it's a necessity, but is it relevant? And then I started to think about it, and I thought that the biggest debates we have in society today, the very biggest that we have, you have Me Too, you have Black Lives Matter, you have LGBT, you have all sorts of debates where society is screaming for inclusivity. And traditionally, beauty has been on the elitist side. It has defined beauty to be a certain thing. And I think it has an enormous role to play. This is an industry with enormous marketing power. It has an enormous role to play to redefine society and to show that beauty exists everywhere, and that we are on an even plane. So for me, that was a big discussion I had in my interview. Do you guys feel like this? And then if you see a fit, then you have a role to play. So that's what I'm coming in to do, to looking at how we can take this forward, and what role this industry has to play in society.
So less of the sort of idealization that the beauty and fashion industries sometimes seem to put forward, and something more inclusive.
A lot, yeah. I think society is asking, for different role models to be considered beautiful, for beauty, the concept of beauty to be taken away from that box that it's this elitist concept that has to be with these measures and in this shape and in this form. So, and it's an interesting thing because on the one hand, I was preaching this, and then I was talking to one of my friends, and I was telling her, oh, but you know, I'm a bit nervous about going to Paris because I'll have to look really good every day, and I'll have to fit in society. And she's like, cut that bullshit, you girl. You're asking for inclusivity. That is you. You wear loud dresses. Wear your loud dresses. I have one underneath, actually, by the way. So I thought, you know, you're right. So in a way, I am also that inclusive force, if you want, coming in. This is a French company. We haven't had, you know, for the first time, we have an Indian gentleman and myself. And the others in the executive committee are European. They're mostly French. There is one Austrian lady. So it's a big change. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a bit about that. You know, how corporate life can be very exciting, but it can also be a bit of a takeover at times. And, you know, how as an individual do you sort of mitigate the effect it has on you, or potentially could have, and the sort of way that it could take you over as an individual?
That's right. It could totally take you over. The pace is fast. Some of it is also, you know, in any material, if you want to be great at it, you have to practice a lot. If you're a great tennis player, if you're a sculptor, if you're a musician, you practice a lot, and business sometimes requires that. So you put your energy to it, and you can very easily lose your identity. Part of this tribal thing, you know, people become the company, their identity becomes the company. If they ever lose their job, they feel, you know, like they've lost everything. Sometimes people get too uptight about hierarchy and how to advance in the ladder and all that stuff. And for me, there's a few things that mitigate that. One was my upbringing, where my parents were always, you know, reminding us how very normal we were. And I think that was also, it was a very wise thing. It was, you know, you're just very normal, feet in the ground, on the ground. The second thing is that I have the most incredible husband who also has, you know, he's my rock, he's a farmer and a philosopher. So he doesn't get dazzled by any of the blah, blah, blah. And I can tell you a wonderful story in a minute about that. The third thing is, of course, I am able to put the two things apart. So when I'm in the office, I never feel guilty that I'm not at home. And when I'm at home, I don't feel guilty I'm not in the office. And I even lose my phone so that I don't even know where it is. So I'm able to do that distinction. And I think it's very important because many times we want to be perfect at everything. And so we are carrying guilt all the time. And I decided that, you know, I can be a perfect mom for 5 minutes. And then I can be perfect in the office for 5 minutes. Of course, I make a lot of mistakes, but you see what I mean. I can give my dedicated attention, but I can't be simultaneously good at both. So I do this thing very well, that I separate. But if you want, I'll tell you the story that I was meaning with Riku, because you will see what happens in our marriage. So one day I made a 1 billion deal. So, you know, I was feeling this is really good. So I was in Mexico and my husband was in Finland. So I gave him a call to, you know, a little bit brag, to be honest. And, you know, we quite just did this deal. But so I called him, and he's a very discreet, very quiet man. So he answers the phone, and how are you? And I'm like, oh, la, 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 I did this deal. La. And he's like, oh, that's very good. You know, very calm. That's very good. And then I asked him, so how about you? How are you? And he says, well, I'm in the forest. Oh, yeah, well, that's great. What are you doing? Well, I'm planting samplings. Oh, great. And how many samplings do you have? Well, I did 500. I've got 500 to go. So I'm going to be here many hours. It's, of course, summer. The days are very long. Oh, that's great. And then he says, but I have a little problem. So I said, oh, really? What is your problem? And he says, well, I happen to be very near fresh bear poop. So I'm near bear poop, and it's fresh. So I'm like, shit, my husband's in the forest, you know, near a bear. So I'm like, and what will you do if the bear comes? He says, well, it's summer, so I expect he's very well fed, or she. But it is not do you have a gun? Well, no, of course not. I have my digging things and my trees. So if it comes, I just pretend I'm dead. But you see, so I just love that. There is never, you know, whatever I do is never grander than meeting a bear in the forest.
So that's the metaphor for the relationship.
Yeah.
And I understand you've been quite bold, characteristically bold, in taking this new role, because you've left the family behind and moved to Paris this week on your own.
Yeah, well, it took 8 weeks between the first call and the move. And we are in the middle of a pandemic. And I just thought, why move my family, who are now very safe in Finland, to France, where there's a lot and there's a curfew. And I know I will work very long hours and I will be feeling guilty in the sense that I never get home because I'm working so late. So this is another way to take the guilt away. We realized we could live like this for a few months, where I dedicate myself to absorb things, and we wait until he's vaccinated and so on, and then we are together again. So we do spend a lot of time apart because he has a farm and I'm always traveling and we have business, but it works very well. We are extremely close and it works, but it is a bit crazy. I agree.
Makes me think of the poem by Robert Frost. It's called Mending Walls. Mm-hmm. And it says in the middle, good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah, you could think of that. I mean, we definitely spend time apart so that we miss each other terribly. And when he's in the winters, when we are together every single day, and for me, it's like a party every day. I mean, I wake up and there's a smoothie waiting for me and this wonderful man with his wisdom, and he's just next to me. So I celebrate every moment of it, because I know that come the summer, I'll see a lot less of him. I'll see him here and there, but I'll see a lot less. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's true. So I wanted to ask you, thinking of bold moves, how it came about that you and your brother left Mexico and ended up in Wales in a very bold move for your parents and for you and Pepe. How did that come about, coming into Atlantic College?
It's an interesting question, and because, you know, my parents were both, you know, from, if you want, working class or lower middle class backgrounds or whatever you want in the Mexican standards. And they, well, my father had become an orphan very young, so he had to work very young. And my mother, who lived in the north of Mexico, managed to convince her parents to let her study in university in Mexico City, which already was very wild at the time. And then my mother worked for a very long time, and she was a professional, and then she married. And then when they had children, they had a very different education philosophy, which was very different to anybody else I know. And I don't know how they came to have this. I don't understand how it happened, but they were very modern in many ways. So first of all, they sent us to a very liberal school. So I grew up in those days. There were no Jewish schools in Mexico. So in my school, there was a lot of Jewish children. There was a lot of children from Spanish refugees. There was, or grandchildren or children of Spanish refugees. It was a very plural environment. There was Lebanese children. And so it was very liberal, open-minded, and so on. And then from the age of 7, they had these crazy ideas. My parents were not rich. They worked very hard. But they had these crazy ideas. When Pep and I were 7 and 8, so I was a 7-year-old, they said to us, it's about time you learn English. So we're going to send you to summer camp. And what they did was that they gave me a little handbag. And in English, it said I had a little paper that said, my name is Blanca. I am going to camp so-and-so in California, la, 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 la. And I had the passports in my bag, because I remember I did lose them. But anyway, I had the passports in my bag. And Pepe and I went together, and I don't know how they even trusted that they just put their kids on a plane to California. And of course, we were—
How old were you?
7 and 8. And we were picked out at the other side by these 2 great hippies with long hair. And then we went to camp, and, you know, we lived there for a month. We liked it so much. We called mom and dad and said we want another month. So we stayed 2 months. And I learned every, you know, peace song, you know, and if I had a hammer, all of them. I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't speak English when I got there. But when I came out of it, I was fluent, and I knew every song, you know, of that generation, of the hippie generation, and so on. So, and then they sent us to France. That's how I speak French, and to stay with the family. Or then they would send us, so they were a little bit wild. At 11, I went to Sweden. I mean, I don't know how they came up with these ideas on our own in the plane. And so actually the step to AC wasn't in principle such a big step. In reality, it was the biggest step in the world, because AC made us in many ways.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a question about that, and then I'm going to ask you another question, and then we're going to open up to some of the questions that are coming in the chat. So I urge people to write anything in there that they want to talk to you about. So Atlantic College, how did it shape you? And how does it, if it does, continue to shape you? What's the legacy?
In every way. In every way. I mean, people like you. I mean, think about it. You come from Mexico and you have friends from all over the world. And one is Palestinian and one is Israeli and Jew. And, you have a Russian. In those days, do you remember? Russia seemed like, the curtain was, the Berlin Wall was very high when we were young. So, we had people from all over the world. And it just taught you to pause a second before you judge. And you try to understand why somebody else thinks so differently than you do. And when you're that young, you welcome these differences. And I think we were also very lucky, because when we were young, there was no Facebook and there was no nothing. So our only connection to home was those 3 phones in the campus that, were in very far away places. And, if you called Mexico, that required like 12-pound coins, which is a lot of money to be stacking in. And, you speak to your parents maybe for 2 minutes, because then it's done. And a letter takes 4 weeks. It was paradise. Suddenly we were there, and, there were no parents. And there was no way to connect our old friends, because it was just too far away. So we became brothers and sisters. And it happens to, all of us from our generation, when we meet, it's like we had spoken yesterday, because the bond was so strong. So for me, you're my brothers and sisters. As you know, when I was 50, instead of having a party with anybody else, I had an AC party, because it's everything to me. It's I'm incredibly grateful. I think I am who I am because of my parents, my husband, and AC.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So my other question is really about being a woman in the world of business, in all of its different opportunities and challenges. It's very different now, I think, for young women coming into business from when we went into it. The whole sort of diversity movement has been transformational to the fortunes of women. Sometimes, as a mother also of a boy, I worry, more about the effects of that on him, actually, as I think the doors are wide open for women. But, how do you, what are your remarks on that, including, whether somebody mentioned in the chat, you haven't had a chance to see it, when we were talking about corporate purpose, the wonderful Anita Roddick, who was a client of mine for a while from Body Shop. And, I kind of wonder about whether women bring a very strong sense of purpose and what matters to business. But certainly I'd like you to comment on that, but also about balance, and you talked about your husband. Hadia's mentioned that in the chat, and your kids, and having to have the boundaries. Can women have it all these days or not? Let's talk about that for a bit.
There are kind of many questions here. The first one is that I would say that for sure there has been bias, and especially there was more bias, and some of it is unconscious. And by the way, it's not only men that have bias, women have bias too. I think we grow up, you know, with the image of draw me a president. If you ask kids, draw me a president, I wonder if today more girls would draw a woman. But as you know, when we were kids, no. So if you say, draw me a doctor, draw me a president, draw me a orchestra conductor, you get men. And if you ask kids, draw me a nurse, draw me a teacher, you'll get women. So I think undoubtedly there are strong male and female stereotypes, and undoubtedly there is bias. And we will come back to that because there's a way to combat it. But you know, I came from Mexico. I am really short. I'm 157. I am
No,
dark.
really?
I'm short. I'm dark. I'm vivacious. I am who I am. And I realized very early on that I could not be something else. I mean, I'm not going to be tall and blonde and quiet. It's impossible. You know, I'm still that ball of fire you described at the beginning. I'm still that ball, and you know, that's who I am. And so I thought, Blanca, you've got to play with the cards you have. There's no point you play with anything else. And so I've always been true to myself and who I am. I haven't tried to be different. And in a sense, you know, I've learned to see where the opportunity lies. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes the expectations on women can be low because people have the prejudice. But I'll give you an example. When I was doing sales, I was the head of sales for Telecom Italia from Nokia. So I had a big account. But the first time I went to Telecom Italia, I went with our then CEO, Olli-Pekka Kalasvuo. So there was him and I, and then our team. And when I arrived to the office of the CFO, I was the only woman. So he greeted everybody, and he sees this short, vivacious, crazy woman. So he thinks, oh, she's the assistant of the CEO. So he skipped me in the row and he said hello to everybody. And then by the time I sat in the table, I was, of course, in the corner and everybody was there. And we started the discussion, you know, the pleasantries, the hellos, and then it got to a tough moment. And then I just said what I thought. Now, this man was a man in his 70s. And I will never forget, because he had his glasses on at the time like this. And when I made my remark and I was sitting over there, he went like this. And he was speechless for a good minute or two, totally speechless. I mean, the guy didn't know, what is this woman? And then, you know, the conversation was good. And from then on, he had enormous respect for me. So you see, the great thing was I didn't complain. I sat in the bloody corner. And then his expectations were so low that he was like, whoa. So I decided, you know, you are what you are. You play your cards. Now, as a boss, I want to be the opposite. I want to not be bound by stereotypes. And stereotypes are bad for men and for women. I think it's very sad that men are told they have to be the sole providers or the main providers. I think it's very sad that they're told to be tough and not nurturing and all that stuff. So I'm very happy when, you know, somebody from my team who's a man says, you know, I've got to go now because I've got to pick up the kids. Sure. You know, so I'm very happy with providing an equal space for my team and for my children. And if I ask my children, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would love for Joachim to tell me a good dad as much as Anna to tell me a great whatever, a great musician. You know, for me, it's important that we don't tie anybody with stereotypes. And I think the great thing about the generation that is coming up is that they are less bound by these stereotypes, and they want flexibility because they want to live life to the full. In all their roles, not just as, you know, employees or whatever. So I really welcome that. I really welcome that.
Yeah. Well, these are the arguments for diversity as a force for good, aren't they?
And then what you were saying about balance, I didn't answer that question, but it's the same for men and for women. I think it's great if we both balance. For me, you know, when the kids were little, I had a very good system. I decided that it takes a village to grow a child. And so the whole village was my ally. My kids were friends with everybody in Helsinki. And I always would hire one girl, and then I would say, or a guy, and I would say, can you hire me your friends? Because some days you're going to have exams, you're going to have your boyfriend, whatever. So here are 5 keys. You're the CEO the CEO of the Juti Kids After School program. And I never wanted to clean. I never wanted to do anything that is boring. You guys just have fun. You go and discover the city, you draw, you go to the park, you whatever. And so people loved working there. And at the end of the week, they would tell me who looked after who and how many hours I owed. And that was great. And then my kids were friends with all the neighbors, the storekeepers. If ever I didn't make it home, they knew where to go eat and I'll pay later. One day my daughter broke her finger. She was 5. By the time I came home, the neighbor who was a doctor was already tending to her, so I just used the village. And I think it was better also for my kids to feel loved by so many people. And of course, their dad and I split the roles very well. But today I do the same thing. I'm a good delegator. I know where to put my attention and where not to put my attention. There's things that just, cleaning my inbox is irrelevant. So why even do it? It's just prioritizing.
Well, you never reply to me, is it?
Oh, probably. No, I did. I always reply to you.
You do. Well, there's quite a lot of comments coming through in the chat about how you're kind of weaving in the multiplicity of demands on your time, personal and professional, into this conversation. It's almost like an embodiment of how you do it in your professional life, I suppose. Hadia's talking about how great it is you're mentioning your husband, because it's so important in the work narrative, how the home is. Someone else has commented, that you're weaving your story around what matters to you, inclusiveness, purpose, the family. So in a way, we're kind of showing in this 45 minutes what you're saying.
Now that you say this, any opportunity I take, it's a family meeting, or any opportunity any of us take. So now before coming here, there were other calls. I got other companies, whatever, and I said, kids, I've got this one, I like it, it's in Paris, what do you guys think? Oh, Mom, are you kidding us? So they were super happy. So when I see my family backs then I do it. There's been one time when they said, no, Mom, let's not do it now. This is not our moment. And I didn't take that opportunity. So, yeah.
So I suppose, there's a very good question here, which goes right to the sort of heart of the commerciality of things like diversity. And what they actually mean for the commerciality of a company, from Jan Peter, my lovely second year, who says, is the atmosphere at L'Oreal much different from the ones in your previous companies because you've got a majority of women on the board? Now, I know you've only just got there, and I don't even know if that's correct.
We have 6 women out of 20 in the executive committee, so it's not a majority. But it is a company where at the director level, you do have a majority. So 54% of directors are women. And I have no doubt that at one point, there will be a female CEO. I have no doubt about it. And the deputy CEO to be is a woman, and actually was the head of operations. Normally operations is and IT. Normally those are very male, and she's done a remarkable job. It's a bit early to say, but it feels it's also the beauty industry. It feels a lot more feminine. I come from beer, which is very different, and technology, which was very different. But diversity is you have to look at diversity in many angles. For instance, Heineken was extremely diverse in nationalities. My team had 64 nationalities. And the presence of Heineken, for instance, in Africa is enormous. So, to be able to sit in a meeting where, there's 8 people and there's 8 nationalities as a de facto thing is incredibly enriching. So there are many ways to look at diversity. You also have diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds. I like to, I was in Heineken, I was leading a team with sustainability, public affairs, and communications. And for that, you need very different skills. You need a person that writes good stories for the media is very different to a person that interacts with government, or a person that knows the nitty-gritties of CO2 and what you have to do in production to lower it. And that also brings a diversity. So I always look to build for that diversity in the most optimal way.
Yeah.
So far with gender, this one feels a bit more balanced in that way, but it's day 4. So I wait to see, but that's the feeling I get indeed.
Yeah. Diversity takes many forms.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question from the chat. And when I've done that, I think we should open up to questions from people directly. I just took a quick look at the attendees, Blanca, and amongst many others that you might recognize, I see Hadia, I see Daniela, I see Gareth Harding, I see Thomas Klein, although he's disappeared to get a coffee or to fix someone's teeth, no doubt. I see Luis, Mirta, Gabor, Lulu, lots and lots of people you know. So I really want one of those. I want one of those people to speak up and ask you a question directly. But the question from your fellow Finn, Petri and Tila, is asking, he says, first of all, it's nice to see both of us having achieved so much, still keeping up the smile and the storytelling. No. And he asks what advice you would have for his 14-year-old daughter who's starting to think about what she could do in her work life in future.
Oh, hyvä kysymys, Petri. So the answer would be, I think one has to start with what makes you tickle? What do you love to do? I think one always has to start with that. You know, it's important that you do something in life that you like to do and that you're good at and you like to do. And normally they go together because you are good at what you like. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that, you know, there are different types of approaches to a career. One is a career of a specialist. Let's say my son, he's an animator. He loves drawing. It's a human need for him. He has to draw every hour. Or every day he has to work in his drawing his life, no matter what he does. So that's a very clear career and it's very specialized. And within that, he can do many things. He can tell stories in many mediums and in many ways, but it's his thing, telling stories and drawing. But there are people like me who had no clue what they wanted to do. And in a way, I still don't. I do what calls my attention at the time. So I'm still learning. So there are people who are generalists and people who are specialists. And I've been a generalist. And I always encourage people not to, if they are that type of person that wants to explore things, I ask them not to try to force themselves into something too narrow. If they're not that type, you know, for somebody who really wants to be a scientist and get the Nobel Prize, then you really have to specialize. But for me, you know, I've done really a range of things. And there's a really good book called Range, actually, that you guys can read. And it basically compares somebody like Tiger Woods and no, I can't remember who it's the tennis that it compares with. The Swiss guy, what's his name?
Federer.
Federer. And Federer, actually, he played a range of sports when he was a kid. He wasn't just playing tennis. So it a little bit depends. So I would just allow people that person to have a conversation with themselves about what do I want to do. The second thing is that there is a plurality of careers that didn't exist before, and there's incredible amount of offering of what you can do. And so I think it's good for people to understand that there is this openness, that you can look for many different things that can fulfill you. And many of these, as we say, didn't exist before. So I'm being very broad because I don't know your daughter, Petri, but I would encourage exploration. I think 14 is very young. You know, still when I finished my PhD at whatever, 25, I had no idea what to do. And I entered business actually serendipitously because I had just arrived to Finland and I was a foreigner. There were no jobs. We were in the middle of the recession. Petri will remember in the early 90s, there was a terrible recession in Finland. And after I'd been a diplomat for the Mexican embassy for a while, which was very much fun, and I did a lot of great things, I realized I don't want to be a diplomat forever. And then I thought, let's try the business track. And so it was serendipitous. Nokia needed somebody and I joined and that's it. So it wasn't so planned. So I think one can go either route.
So there's another question here from Hadia, but I can't see her in the gallery. So I don't know if she is in a position to ask this question herself. about young people going into a communications career.
Hi, Rhian.
Yes!
It's so nice to see you all. Really, such a joy and a pleasure. Thank you, Blanca. I don't want to repeat actually what was just asked, but my daughter, she's 18, so slightly older than the 14-year-old, and she's a generalist, not so sure what she wants to do, but leaning onto communication and business. But I think I'm the one who's encouraging her to go in that direction. I see that she may have the potential. But I think that, you've sort of answered the question. It's hard because of that multiplicity of choices, like in a way in our time, it was easier. We didn't have that gamut to choose from.
Well, I would say, she could try it. If it's something that calls her attention, even within communications, there's many different métiers. You can be the social media person, or you can be the storyteller that crafts messages, or you could be the visual artist that creates content, or, there's just so many, or financial communications are very specific. There's very many métiers within that. So it's always worth trying a bit. And then there's many industries, and so it's always worth getting an internship. I would suggest is a good thing. And I often find that if you want to do communications in business, it's very good to have a business background as well, because often what can happen if you're very just specialist on communications is that many communications people want to create content for the sake of content. But you always need to think, what is this for? Mm-hmm. Who is this towards? You need to think a little bit more broadly. And I think understanding business or having another point of view than just communications can be very enriching.
Yeah, thank you for that.
So a major and a minor might be a good idea.
Thank you.
Tell her to call me.
Okay.
Well, Blanca, I think, good to see you, Hadia. There is another question here. Sophia, do you want to ask that yourself about internships? Are you there? Would you like me to ask?
That's something you just mentioned. Like in your last comment. I was wondering, because I'm still in school and I'm also a generalist, which puts me with the problem that I don't really know what to do. So I was wondering, does it really make any sense to do an internship before having any experience in uni and any focus on really what to do?
Well, why not? If you can find an opportunity to do it, it could be great. The problem is that it's not always easy to find a place where you can intern. My son, when he was younger, he often did little stints in the holidays in marketing agencies. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he's a bit of a storyteller. So he learned to do a little bit like copy for advertising and things like that. But the problem is that it's not sometimes so easy. But if you just have the opportunity, why not? Never close options. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much.
And then when you go to university, Sophia, don't let that limit you either. As you see, I'm an anthropologist. When I studied anthropologist, I honestly thought I would be in actual like tribes in the bush. Now I'm in tribes in buildings. I'm in tribes in concrete buildings. It's the same thing. Don't tell anybody. It's exactly the same thing. But you can totally use what you've learned in another environment. So once you do something, it doesn't mean you have to be stuck forever. You can still evolve from there and build on it.
And Blanca, the wheel has come full circle because you're now dealing with war paint.
Wall paint.
WAR, not WALL. War paint, from a tribal anthropological perspective.
Yes.
Women and their war paint.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I scanned the chat now, and I think we've pretty much covered most of the, either directly or indirectly, the questions that have been asked. And that's quite good timing because it's 5:02, amazingly. So we've been talking for nearly an hour. So I did say that there would be no curveball questions when I spoke to you earlier.
But you've got one. That's
But
fine.
I did just want to ask you in a rather opportunistic way, whether you had any thoughts about what the relationship might be able to be between L'Oreal and Atlantic College, and how Atlantic College might somehow help L'Oreal, and also how L'Oreal might somehow help Atlantic College.
I hadn't thought about that, but I like the curfew question. I like the challenge. Let me think about it. Yeah.
I hand that over to Andrea as the beginning of the next conversation offline. Well, it's lovely to talk to you, and I'm going to let Carissa close the conversation for us all.
So much.
Good to speak to
you.
Hello, can everyone hear me again? I have
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Blanca and Rhian, for what I thought was a really motivational and inspiring conversation. I just love the energy. I hope you've all enjoyed the event as much as I have. Please feel free to put your feedback, get your feedback to us via the post-event survey, and that link will be available in the chat. And thank you to our audience for also being engaged and forever supportive in our InConversation events. And we really look forward to you hopefully joining us next week, where we are joined by Baroness Helena Kennedy QC, who is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers, to discuss the topic of human rights in a troubled world. Thank you so much once again, everybody. Thank you for your time, Blanca and Rhian, and it's been very special. So thank you so much.
Oh, what a pleasure. And now that I see, you know, my brother's there and Luis is there and so many people like Gareth and Daniela, and I see so many people I love. So my love to you all. Thank you. Thank you very much.